always afterward. I see that the recording is started. So this means that what we say from now will be recorded. Okay. Very important PDU code. We will repeat the PDU code later also in the chat. And be careful, every session, has its own code, so that you take the right code for the right session. Okay, now, this is the title of the presentation, who will be done by, I could say it after some years, my good friend Nader. And to be honest, I don't think that Nader needs a lot of introduction. He's one of the co-writers of the PIMBOK 7. So for us, to be honest, it's really, we are happy that it's here, and we are honored that he wants to take time for us. So I'm not going to tell you more. I leave it up to him. He's a very interesting speaker, and I'm sure you will enjoy the session. So I will stop my sharing, and then Nader, you can share your screen, and I'll leave the word to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jack. It was very kind of you.
Great.
Can you
coming?
see? Yeah. All right. So it's up there.
Yeah.
Are you sure?
I'm sure.
All right. Okay, great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. I'm very happy to be here with you in PMI Belgium and Netherlands and Luxembourg once again. Yeah, I'm very happy about that. So I'm going to keep the session relatively short in case you want to have questions and answers. It's a little bit risky because we may reach the end of the session and there may be no questions at all, but well, we'll see. Mainly, the idea that I have in mind and I'd like to share with you starts with my own experience in projects. It was about 24 years ago when I started, and at that time, everything I used to do was really simple. I started as a project planner, and I had plans that were, for example, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 activities in it. And that's because that was the best I could do. You know, I just started my work. I didn't know a lot, and well, that was fine, relatively. But I used to run into different types of problems. And in response to those problems, and more importantly, based on what I learned about project management, I started adding more to what I was doing, adding more elements. My plans were getting more sophisticated, if you will. And there was this point in my career, maybe after 10 years of starting, that I was responsible for a process plan project for planning and controlling and monitoring and so on. And the plan that I created for that project was about 90,000 activities long. That was 90, not 19. That was a lot. I was very happy about it at the beginning. But then you can imagine as we went on with the project, it became more and more difficult to use that plan. Maintaining that plan itself is like a project. It's a lot of work. It didn't mean that what I had in that plan was not useful. Everything that I had in that was useful. It was adding some benefits. But the problem was that the amount of effort that I had to put into that was a lot more. It was not justifiable. But there's something even more important. The more important thing is that it was hurting our project. Yeah. Because what I had there was too complicated. And because of its complexity, people could not relate to it. It was making our communications more difficult, the collaborations more difficult. So in practice, I was doing more, but what I was getting, the results were worse than before, which is horrible. So at that point, I realized that I have to make it simple again. But it's not the same type of simple as I had before, because the initial simple option was because of my lack of knowledge, because I couldn't do better than that. But the later one, the last one that I was moving toward, was not because I couldn't, it was because I wanted to. And it may look the same, but it's not. It has a different essence. It has a different behavior in practice. That's why I call it minimalist instead of simple. And when we talk to project managers, if we start talking about simplified systems, everyone thinks that that's for children, for example. Something simplified is not for a person who's really good at what they do. But that's not the case. Our target audience are all smart people. They can manage complexity. But the reason that we want to have something simple or minimal is that it's more effective. It's more effective because it's easier to learn, it's easier to use, and it's easier to teach. For some reason, my slides shift a little bit, but that's okay. We try to cope with it. All right, so back to this. This part about teaching, that's very important. I don't think that it's something limited to professional trainers, those people who spend most of their time teaching project management. In fact, the important thing here is that teaching is something we all have to do as project managers. When you're a project manager, you have to teach your project management team how to do their work. You also have to tell other people in your team how the project is working. You have to tell the rest of the company. You have to explain it. You also have to let external stakeholders know about it, the customer, the suppliers. They all need to know how to work with you. And that's a type of teaching. And when your system is minimalist, when it's simple, it's easier to teach. So that's a great advantage for you. Overall, it's more sustainable, we can say, based on the theme of the conference. So I think not 100% of people agree that a minimalist system is a good idea, but I think maybe 70% agree. And in that case, the question is, how can we create a minimalist system? The first thing that we can do is to use direct methods. For example, the 80-20 rule. When you use the 80-20 rule and focus on the 20% of the elements that create 80% of the benefits in your system, you will have a simpler system. There will be fewer elements in your system. And that's really great. Only if you use the 80-20 rule in your project management system, you will gain a lot, probably. Or better, maybe I can say you can get a lot of great things in your project management system. However, there's something else here that can help you, and that's practically my main message here. The other thing that we have here, and I've selected a really fancy name for it, is the level of abstraction, which has different consequences, and one of them is minimalism, but there's more to it. Now, what is that? That's about what you focus on when you're thinking about your project management system. If you imagine the different elements that you have in your project, there's a hierarchy, there's a relationship between those elements. Some of them are causes, and some of them are the effects of those causes. Now, we can imagine it as a tree, which is not 100% accurate because Usually each cause has multiple effects and each effect has multiple causes. But for simplicity, I'm showing it as a tree here. The main message is that the effects are more than the causes. That's key here. When you're dealing with effects, you will have more elements and things become more complicated. While if you focus on the causes, on the root causes, on the fundamentals, then you have only a few elements and it becomes a lot easier to work with them. And the system that you create where your focus and your attention is to the causes and fundamentals instead of the details and effects, that system will have a tendency to become minimalist. As an example, look at that tree and imagine one of those little things, those leaves at the end. It can be an issue in your organization. The issue can be, for example, you have those fancy resource allocation things based on hours, and you can never rely on that. People count on it that at a certain day, they will have access to a certain resource. But the day comes and that resource is not available. So it causes a lot of problems. How would you address that problem? You can deal with it on top of that tree with the leaves, but that would be very difficult. However, if you step back, think about the lower parts of the tree, the root causes. You may realize in a certain case, as an example, that the root cause of having those resource allocation problems is that you simply have too many projects at the same time. You're working on 40 or 50 projects at the time. And it doesn't matter how you manage your projects, you will always have project management problems. So you decide to limit the number of projects to maximum 5. And suddenly, here's the difference. When you do that, it doesn't solve only that one small problem. It solves multiple problems. You will lose half of that tree all of a sudden, very easily. And the change will be sustainable because when you focus your efforts into one of those leaves and try to solve it without going deeper, it may look like you've solved it, but you've probably seen that before. A few weeks later, it goes back to where it was. Or you may solve it, but you may cause 3 or 4 other problems. But when you address the bottom of the tree, chances are lower than it will happen, which is great. Have you heard about this? It's a very interesting correlation. There's a strong correlation between the increase in ice cream sales and increase in drowning deaths. That's a fact. That's for real. Okay. What does it mean? Does it mean that in order to prevent those accidents, we have to limit the sales of ice cream? No, obviously not. Because there is no causal relationship between the two of them. It's a simple example. I know that you know it, but I will make a connection very soon. So the reason that there's such a correlation here is that they have a common cause. The common cause is the weather. When it gets warmer, more people go to swim, and it increases the number of accidents. And at the same time, they like to have more ice cream because it's hot. That's why there is such a correlation, but it doesn't mean that you can create the connection between those effects, those leaves on the tree. In order to make an impact, you have to go deep, find the cause, the real cause, and work there. Now, when you think about this abstract example, it's really easy. No one will try to pass a regulation against ice cream in order to avoid deaths. But when we come to the projects, we really do that. Sometimes in projects, we limit the sales of ice creams in order to avoid deaths because all we focus on are those top leaves on this tree. We don't go deep enough. A more generalized problem here is what is called the cargo cult effect. You may have heard about it. It's a very, very interesting story. And I keep telling that story all the time. Jack, for example, here may have heard me talking about that at least 3 or 4 times, but it's worth it. During the war, there were a few islands completely isolated from the civilized world, and the US Army builds a base in one of those islands for their military purposes. And every once in a while, they had cargo planes coming to the island and bringing cargo for the soldiers. And they used to give out some of that cargo or trade it with the natives. And you can imagine how interesting it was for those people, the things coming from the civilized world that they've never seen in their lives. So that was very interesting until the war was over. And the soldiers left the island, there was no base anymore, and no cargo anymore. So they said, let's fix it. Let's find a way to have the cargo. So how does it work? In order to have the cargo, we need to have the cargo planes. Okay, let's focus on that. How can we have cargo planes coming and landing on the island? As we've seen before, what happens is that there has to be this thing, the airport, and other planes in the airport, and then the planes see that and they land and bring the cargo. That's okay, we'll take care of that. And they did. They created mock-ups of airports, mock-ups of planes. In this picture, you can even see the runway and the tower. They even had rituals to light the sides of the runway and sitting there during the evenings, looking at the sky, waiting for the planes to land. And as you can imagine, it never happened. Why didn't it happen? That didn't happen because they only focused on the surface, on the leaves of that tree. They didn't go deep to understand the dynamics behind what they are doing. They only try to imitate others. Does it sound familiar by any chance? Unfortunately, this is what many of us are doing in our projects. Many of the so-called agile projects where people think that by only having a lot of sticky notes, a lot of boards and daily meetings and other rituals like that, they become agile. It's like the cargo cult effect. Or in predictive projects where people think that as long as they have a document, they can call a business case and a diagram that looks like a Gantt chart, they are really fine in the project management. But these are all on the surface. What's beneath that? Sometimes there's nothing beneath it. So when you take a look at this tree, there are multiple reasons for us to go deeper toward the root causes. And one of them is that we would be able to have a minimalist system, but other things is that it helps us avoid the cargo cult effect. Now, when we try to create a system, those things that deal with the leaves on top of the tree are mainly the artifacts and rituals. Those things that deal with the middle of the tree are mainly the processes. And when we are working on the bottom, we are thinking about the most fundamental things in our project. You can call it anything you want. The labels are really, really not important. But in many cases, we call those the principles, or at least those things can be summarized as principles. So some of you can guess where I want to go from here. that brings us to the story of the PMBOK guide. That's what we did in the 7th edition of the PMBOK guide. The previous editions were all in the middle of the tree. They were all about the processes in project management. And while it is fine, it is helpful, it has the risk, multiple risks. The cargo cult effect, the risk of not having a simple, effective system. And to avoid those things, in the 7th edition of the PMBOK guide, we moved everything from the middle to the bottom. We went deeper. We started thinking about the principles that we have in our projects, the things that we really want to happen. Let me go back. Here, it doesn't mean that there's no value in artifacts and rituals at all. That's not what it means. What it means is that if you start with artifacts and rituals and stay there, then it won't work for you. It would be the cargo cult effect. That's exactly the cargo cult effect. The artifacts and rituals are only useful when they are there to satisfy certain processes. So in order to have proper artifacts and rituals, you need to have proper processes. And in order to have proper processes, you need to start with principles. And you need to have a connection between them. Each process that you have in your system should be there only to satisfy a certain principle. You need to know why you are doing things. It's not only because the PMBOK guide says so, or someone who's really good in project management says that you need to have that element. Have things only for purposes. So that was the reason for the changes in the PMBOK guide. We switched from a process-based system to a principle-based system. It had multiple reasons, but one of the consequences is that it automatically encourages people to have more minimalist systems. You don't have to have a minimalist system, but it really makes it easier for you to do if you want, which is great, I would say. Another example is P3 Express. P3 Express itself is in the middle. It's about the processes, but then it has its own cousin called Noop. And Noop is all about principles. In the first version, we created P3 Express, and then later on, we started thinking about principles. Instead of adding the principles inside P3 Express, we realized that those principles are not really limited to P3 Express. They can apply to every type of project. So we kept them as general as possible. And it's provided in a different package called Nope. But then in the next edition of P3 Express, we went back and evaluated everything in P3 Express based on Nope, based on principles. We created a really strong relationship. And one of the consequences, which was very interesting, was that the new edition of the P3 Express method is a lot simpler. It's more minimalist. For example, in the first edition, I think we had 9 artifacts, if I'm not wrong. But in the new version, we have only 4. And out of those 4, actually one of them is something very special that doesn't exist in other systems. So if you don't count that, there's only 3. And they work. People are comfortable using that. So why not? In case you're interested, this is the whole system for P3 Express. There's this process where we start by initiating the project, and then we have monthly cycles. It's very simple. Cycles really help us simplify and have a more minimalist system because they repeat the same thing. So those cycles, monthly cycles, repeat. At the beginning, we initiate the monthly cycle. That's where we add more details to the plans. Then we have the weekly management system. That's where we measure progress, try to come up with ways to recover from deviations and so on. And then we have daily management. That's where we deal with issues and risks and so on. At the end of the month, we close the monthly cycle. we evaluate the satisfaction of stakeholders and so on. And then we repeat. We repeat it multiple times until we are done. We will close the project. And then there's this post-project cycle. That's there only for people who don't have a portfolio management system, and they will use it to evaluate the benefits of the project, come up with ideas for improving, increasing benefits, and so on. If you're interested, you can find the manual for P3 Express here. And there's also an e-learning course for P3 Express. It's published really recently, only a couple of weeks ago, and it's still better. It's not copy edited or anything, but you can find it here. And everything is in P3 Express is free and open source, so it's not commercial. So that was it. And the whole idea can be summarized with this tree. The tree that is the causal relationship between elements. And my main message is that one thing that really helps you in many different ways is to go deep and think about the fundamental aspects instead of consequences, instead of small effects in your project. When you think about the fundamental aspects, you will avoid problems such as the cargo cult effect, and you can have a minimalist system, which is a lot easier to use. Thank you. As I said, going to be short and ready for questions.
Good. Thank you, Nader. And indeed, 30 minutes is perfect. Are there questions? Because I saw that Xavier asked in the chat. Okay, I have one question, Nader. What happened to your project with 90,000 tasks?
Oh, actually, I had to change it. After, after 4 or 5 months, I had to change it and make it simpler because it was really a nightmare. It was a really good technical exercise, and I learned a lot, but it was not something you want to live with.
Okay. One thing that I remembered from your explanation is that you say, and I fully agree with that, that the why question becomes much more important. And I often say to people, we have to become, again, a young child. Because if you ask a child to do something, the first thing they say, why? Eat your breakfast, why? So. Yeah,
that's really important. And something I see is that many people say that we have a problem in our project, and you ask, okay, so what is your problem? They're trying to solve that problem. And when you ask, they say, we don't have, for example, proper resource management. And I always say that's not really a problem. That's the default solution that you're coming up with. You have a different problem, and you automatically think that having better resource management would solve that problem. But that's too soon to limit yourself to one solution. Let's just stay with the problem, analyze the problem, and see what the best solution can be.
Good.
Okay, I think we have a few questions.
Yeah.
So the first one, could you please remind us or give more information how to link Ishikawa diagram and your cause and consequences analysis? There's a 90-degree difference between them. It's not so different, really. Although both of them suffer from the problem that I mentioned before, because in the real world, we don't have a tree because the cause and effect diagram is also a tree. It's just 90 degrees that way. But in reality, we don't have trees. We have graphs because the relationship is many to many. But other than that, the main difference here is that we are using a diagram to make a point in both of these. The points that we are making here is really related to what is done over there, but not exactly the same. They have a system method to get to a certain answer, but here what I'm trying to do is to encourage you to think about the fundamentals in general, in all cases. But they are, of course, completely related. There's no doubt. The next one is, in our company, they started daily meetings and now they think they're working agile. Yes, that's very common. That's very, very common. There are lots of these things. I was somewhere, I was presenting, I think it was in actually one of the past PMI Belgium conferences. And my presentation was about the fact that having a hybrid system doesn't make sense, because your system has to have internal consistency. And then I explained a lot why it won't work, and that all depends on how you define what agile is. And usually what people define doesn't make a lot of sense. In practice, agile is the use of an adaptive system, and the opposite is a predictive system. These two are two sides, they don't come together. But then someone says, but we do use hybrid systems. So, okay, what do you do when you call it hybrid? And she said, we use a Scrum, but we also have a project charter. These are exactly the cargo cult type of problem. We see something called project charter as an element that makes us predictive, or we see daily meetings as something that makes us agile, and none of them do that. Being predictive or adaptive or anything else is about the dynamics that are behind all these elements. These elements are on the surface. And based on what happens on the background, you're either predictive or adaptive or something else. You have an effective system or you don't have, and so on. Thanks for the point there. So we have a comment. The why is the key to give the aim. Yes, that's correct. It never hurts to ask why, really. It's a little difficult for me to read the chats because when a new chat comes, it jumps up. So I'm trying to hold the scroll bar.
No problem. We can manage if you want. No problem with that. With Jack, we can manage the chat and to give you a question if you need.
Thanks, but I'm a lot easier if I read it myself, because when I listen, I forget really soon. When you're at the end of the statement, I've already forgotten the beginning.
Okay, no problem.
It's okay.
So
I'm holding the scroll bar, and it's fine. Yeah. But thanks. So the next one, how did you change your 90K task? Oh, okay. So that's the same as what you asked, Jacques.
Yeah.
I really had to make it simple again. It took me a lot of work, and it was a lot of trouble because I had to go back to the customer, receive approval for it. It was a nightmare, but I had to do it. What has been the level of adoption of P3 Express? It's a little hard to say because P3 Express is really, really privacy friendly. We don't ask people to submit emails. We don't force people to submit emails or report back something. So everything we know is what people tell us. But it seems like it's growing. For example, I've seen a few books in different languages. I see more and more training courses or webinars about it. There was even this person who told me that she was going to an interview and they asked her if she's familiar with P3 Express, which was really interesting for me. But in general, we have to see. In case you don't know, the EC has funded P3 Express. They started about 2 years ago. They pay for the expenses, which is really great because P3 Express is free. And with their support, we're going to have a lot more happening. And one of them is regional conferences. There will be one in Belgium, one in Germany, one in Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Ireland. These are finalized and the rest will come later. So when we have those conferences and get together with people, we will learn a lot more about that. The next one is, based on my previous remark, you could use a tree with its roots. The tree or the project can have many roots. Of course, yeah, that's extreme simplification. That diagram is extremely simplified only to make a point. That doesn't match the reality. In reality, we don't even have trees. They are graphs with many-to-many relationships. Thanks for the comments and questions, but Jacques, feel free to tell me how much time we have. Otherwise, I'll go on with all of it.
Well, there is one question still that I found very interesting. If you look at it, it's from Joyce. I don't know if you can read it.
Yes, I can see it here. I agree with you that minimalism, to make it simple, is the solution. It's best if I read all of it and then come back. But I'm not saying that minimalism is the solution. Minimalism is a way of thinking about coming up with a good solution. Okay. But anyway, let me read the rest of it. If I have to teach project management to a group of women who have never been taught project management, but would like to undertake a really small business, no matter what it is, I do not have an idea here. How can I start with them? What would be the first thing to do? PMI tools and techniques are really complex. I know that I will not use them. Well, the first thing is to make sure that they really have projects, because there are many people who have business as usual, they have operations, and try to see it as projects and try to fit project management systems, which usually don't work well. So that's the first thing. If you're sure that they have projects, then you go to the next step. Otherwise, it's best to get help from someone who's expert in managing operations. For their project management, well, my approach is something minimalist and simple. Take a look at the e-learning course that I suggested. That's my preferred way of teaching. The whole e-learning course is a story. That's an interactive story where the player plays the role of the first character in the story. They go on, make decisions. Based on the decisions they make, they go to different paths, experience different things, and those experiences are what they learn. The advantage with this way of training is that it's easy for everyone to relate to, even if they don't have any experience in project management before. Maybe that would work for you. And if you want, you can reuse all the material in P3 Express because that's open source. You don't even have to ask for permission. You can just copy everything, adjust it to your liking, and go on with it. There's one before that here. It reminds me of the law of conservation of trouble. As long as you don't solve the root cause, the problem will always pop up in one way or another. Great comment, thank you. That was nice. Have you faced information loss when following minimalism? If yes, how do you handle such situations? That's a good question. When you have a minimalist system, you're removing things. And a lot of things that you remove have useful information or have benefits in them. But you still do that because you want to increase the overall value. And the overall value is the ratio between the benefits and the efforts. That's the whole thing. We have to be prepared to do that. Sometimes doesn't feel good. And especially if you have engineering background, like myself, you want to save everything. You want to be 100% accurate sometimes, depending on the type of engineering, of course. But it seems necessary. It also reminds me of something. There's this famous quote. I don't remember who said it, but he was a writer. He was a really good and famous writer. And he says, when you want to be a good writer, you have to kill your darlings. And he's referring to parts of the writing, of course, not to human beings. But the point is that you have to, when you write something, it can be a story, it can be fiction. There are lots of things there that you really like and you will spend time on them and they are doing something positive. But overall, when you look at it, if you remove them, it will create a better final work. So you try to fight with that inner force that wants to keep everything and you remove them. And hopefully you get a better result. The next one, standard PM methodologies are often used in large organizations to ensure quality in execution, and often they try to be exhaustive and cover every possibility, the opposite of minimalist. How do you nurture trust with the stakeholders if you leave out some elements? It's a trade-off, of course. We are losing something, and in return, we are gaining something. What we gain here is a system that is easier for every stakeholder to understand and communicate with. Because in complicated and complex systems, everyone is lost. They may sometimes pretend that they are comfortable with it, but they are not. If you think about the customer, they may say that they are really happy when you have a really complicated system, but what makes them really happy is a system that they can work with, where they can be part of, where they can get what they want from it. The way I've tried it in the past is because you cannot fight with what they believe. If you suddenly start making it really minimalist, they may think that you're not doing your work properly. So what I did was that we had a transition. We kept everything we had before, and then we created our minimalist system as the main driver, but then we were recreating the complications based on the facts afterward, only for presentation. So they were still getting what they wanted, the complicated things, but in addition to that, we were also giving them the outputs of our minimalist system. It took us about, I think, 3 months, where the customer told us that we don't need to send them those complicated things anymore. The new things are what they really like. We didn't even tell them that we are making these changes. We just told them that we are just generating extra things. They told us that you don't need to send us those things anymore. The new one is okay. That was a very safe way of transitioning here. Okay, where were we? I'm lost. Okay, I think I found where I was before. Yeah. The bottom border is Einstein quote. Things should be made as simple as possible, but not any simpler. Of course, yeah. We should not use minimalism as an excuse to create something that doesn't work, that doesn't have enough elements, of course. Sorry to come back on my question on how you made your big project simple, because I still do not know. Did you cut your project in several projects, or did you use rolling wave planning? We removed the amount of detail in that case. In that case, our way was to remove the amount of detail. So in the initial plan, we were going as much as, I think, activities that were taking 4 or 5 hours. We turned that into a plan for activities that take 3 or 4 days. And the rest of that was left to the team leaders and so on to decide. We thought that we don't need to tell them exactly what they have to do at what time. They can find it out. And again, to be sure there's no misunderstanding, that's what we did in that case. I'm not saying that it's the best way of doing it. The next one is, can we see minimalism as an added tool in the project manager toolkit and something to be used mainly when we need to be value delivery oriented? I would say no. First, because it's not a tool like every other tool. It's about the way you use tools. So it's in a different level of abstraction. It's about your approach to using tools, and that's how you have to see it. And the relationship with value delivery. We always have to deal with value in many different ways. Now, if you have a predictive project where the relationship between the product and the benefits and outcome is defined outside the borders of the project, you don't do value management so seriously for the product of the project. You still support some people to do some things, but that's not your main responsibility. But still, in those cases, you need to do value management for your project management activities. That's what we have in the 7th edition of the PMBOK guide as well. There's one of the principles about being adaptive. And I'm always worried that it may cause problems. Fortunately, I don't see a lot of problems yet, but there is a potential. Because we don't want to tell people that being adaptive is the right way of working. You can be adaptive or predictive depending on the type of project you have. That's a different thing. Predictive systems work very well for the right type of product, and adaptive the same. But then what we really wanted to say there is that you need to be adaptive when it comes to your project management system. And that can always be subject to adaptation. The next one. Yes, I know. I am already following Bunny BR4, who is really nice for simplifying project management. That's great. I don't know them, unfortunately. I'll take a look. Thank you. And
the rest are no more questions. It's more.
All right.
Okay. Great. Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We were 61, which is really a great number to start. We also had a lot of questions, and that's very good once we start. So this means that the subject attracts people because it's a little bit different from what we normally do. So last thing I want to say is thank you, Nader. Thank you, everyone, for attending this session. And the recording will be placed on the PM Fair. If you allow us, Nader, if you say I don't want it, we're not going to put it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Jack. Thanks to Brian and everyone who helps in for the conference. Great as usual. And thanks to everyone for coming. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Congratulations. That was great.